Comics Recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a comic called The Strange Talent of Luther Strode. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. This is Luther Strode. He was just shot 7 times, but not a single bullet pierced his muscles. It's because Luther had a strange talent. Everything started when Luther Strode got his hands on a book called The Hercules Method. Pete told Luther that this book won't work, but Luther was optimistic. Luther was in his room along with his friend Pete. Pete suggested that Luther hook up with Petra, which Luther shrugged off. When Pete left, Luther started reading the book and followed its guide to working out. The key to the Hercules method was to focus every aspect of your life toward a goal. By doing this, one can have those aspects under conscious control. Luther worked hard but was not seeing immediate results in his body. After a couple of days of training, Luther's appetite grew exponentially. He ate thrice as much as he used to and drank an additional 2 gallons of milk and juice. He could also see things before they happened, such as when his mother dropped a plate. Luther ran and caught it before falling. Even before the plate slipped from his mother's hands, he had already seen it happen. Luther heard a knock on the door. It was Pete, and it was time for school. He went out of his house and made his way to his school. Upon arriving, Luther saw Petra. Pete saw Luther looking at Petra, so he shoved Luther toward Petra for them to talk. Luther bumped into Petra. He was embarrassed and blushed. But before Luther could speak, Paul, the bully, interrupted them and made fun of Luther. Surprisingly, Petra defended Luther by insulting Paul, and to Luther's luck, Petra kissed Luther. Paul left humiliated and threatened Luther he'd get him back for what Petra had done. Later that day, it was PE class, and they were playing dodgeball. Luther and Pete were teammates, but on the other side were Paul and his buddies. Paul threw a ball at Pete and hit him in the face. Paul was still angry about what happened earlier and aimed the ball at Luther. Paul threw the ball as hard as he could at Luther, but Luther caught the ball and threw it back at him. Before throwing the ball, Luther could see in advance where Paul would move. It was a sure hit. The ball hit Paul right in the nose and knocked him flat on the ground. Paul was returning to school. He had missed a couple of school days because of his broken nose. Luther was nervous. He knew Paul would go after him for sure. Paul barged in while Luther and Pete were in the bathroom, ready to fight. Luther backed off, saying he did not want any trouble, but Paul was fuming. Paul punched Luther in the stomach, causing him to kneel. He picked up Luther and insulted Petra in his face. Luther was enraged. He looked at Paul and saw him as only muscle, no skin. Luther squared up and punched Paul right in the chin, knocking him unconscious. Meanwhile, a tall and buff bald guy named the librarian talked to 5 persons wrapped in straitjackets and chained in their arms, feet, and neck. The librarian told them that he had found a candidate with exceptional promise. It was Luther. After a 6-week hiatus, Luther returned to school. Luther appeared buff and had vastly improved his reflexes. Upon entering, all eyes were on Luther. Shortly, Paul approached. Paul had trouble with his speech because of the punch Luther gave him. Pete made fun of Paul's speech. This made Paul attempt to punch Pete, but Luther stopped him. Paul walked away. Petra approached them and asked Pete to leave. Petra told Luther she had been sending signals to him ever since she saw him. Confused, Luther asked her what she meant by signals. Petra kissed Luther and told him that was a signal. Paul was working out in his room with thoughts of getting back at Luther for his beating. He noticed there was a red stain on his ceiling. Paul went up the stairs to check it out. He was surprised to see his parents brutally dismembered and killed by a bald buff guy. It was the librarian. Paul ran, but the librarian quickly reached him. He tried to fight back, but the librarian overpowered Paul. Meanwhile, Luther worked out using the Hercules method in his room when Petra suddenly entered using his window. Luther stumbled and quickly grabbed a pair of pants since he was in his underwear. Petra told Luther she broke in because her previous signals were too subtle for him. The next day, Luther and Pete were at a convenience store. Pete was disappointed in Luther because he did not go all the way with Petra when she broke into his room. Suddenly, 2 armed masked men entered and declared a robbery. Luther told Pete to get down and take cover. Luther saw the robber harassing a female customer. Luther was enraged, so he threw a milk gallon towards the robber. The milk gallon hit the robber and threw him to the wall, but it did not immobilize him. So the 2 robbers started shooting at Luther. Luther grabbed pieces of beef jerky and threw them at the nozzle of the robbers' guns. The beef jerkies were stuffed inside the nozzles, rendering the guns useless. Luther then picked up the 2 robbers and smashed them against each other, subduing them. Luther and Pete fled the scene, and the police arrived to clean up the mess. Pete gave Luther a leather jacket, steel-toed boots, and a mask. "Voila! Your superhero costume," said Pete. Luther wasn't feeling the costume and said he wasn't a superhero, but Pete insisted he was. Pete told Luther that he should use his abilities to help powerless people. What Pete said made Luther remember how his father used to beat his mother helplessly. It was the reason why Luther was always protective of women. Luther agreed with Pete's suggestion to become a superhero. Luther tried to sneak outside his house, but his mom caught him. They struck a light conversation. Luther asked his mom if she was okay being alone in the house, considering what had happened with his father. His mom told him she was okay. She was worried since his father has been released from prison. Luther assured his mother that even if his father found them, he wouldn't be able to hurt her anymore, because Luther would protect her now. They hugged, and Luther went on his way. Luther put on his costume and looked for anybody who needed help. While on the roof of a building, Luther saw a man arguing with a woman. The woman was dragged to a dark alley. Luther leaped into action and pulled the man away from the girl, which sent him to the ground. Surprisingly, the woman attacked Luther, telling him not to touch the man. Confused, Luther left the scene. Petra was in her room making her assignment when a rock hit her window. When she looked outside, she saw Luther. Petra invited Luther into her room, but before he could enter, Petra heard a voice behind her, and she immediately closed her window. Meanwhile, the two robbers from the convenience store were riding behind a police car headed to prison. Suddenly, a hand bust through the driver's side roof and the passenger's side roof. The hands grabbed the heads of the two police officers in front of the car and squeezed them until the heads exploded. The robbers were terrified at what they saw. The police car suddenly stopped and the door was ripped open. The librarian emerged, holding the doors in his hands, and approached the robbers. Like what he did to the police officers, he squeezed the heads of the two robbers until they exploded. Pete showed Luther the image of the headless robbers on his phone. They both thought it was weird that those Luther fought, Paul and the two robbers, were all killed. Petra arrived, and Luther immediately noticed bruises on her arm. Luther asked Petra what happened, but she brushed him off and laughed. Later, Luther confronted the man he had fought in the alley. Luther had found out that not only was this man physically hurting women, but he was also involved in selling illegal substances. The man drew a gun and pointed it at Luther, but Luther was too fast and pulled it out of the man's hand. The man punched Luther in the chest but had no effect. Luther told the man to keep hitting him. No matter how hard the man hit Luther, it had no effect. "My turn," said Luther. He grabbed the man's arm and broke it. Luther slammed the man to the ground and threw him across the room. Surprisingly, another man entered the room. It was a bald and buff guy. It was the librarian. Luther was confused. He did not know this man. The librarian told Luther to finish the man he was beating. Luther refused, saying it was already finished. The librarian sped toward Luther and struck him in the stomach. Luther crashed into the wall. Luther looked at the librarian and was surprised why he could see the librarian's moves ahead of time. Luther determined this had to be the man that killed Paul and the two robbers. The librarian acknowledged Luther and told him he was the killer. Enraged, Luther lunged at the librarian and asked him who he was. The librarian caught Luther and kicked him to the ground, making a big hole. The librarian then introduced himself before Luther went unconscious. Meanwhile, the man Luther beat up was named Vin, and he was a member of a dangerous group. Vin was in a hospital and was visited by the leader of his group. Vin's leader was surprised when his phone rang, and Vin's name popped up on the screen. He answered. The person on the other side of the call was the librarian. The librarian disclosed information that would lead the group to where Luther's loved one was. The group, after hearing this, immediately went to the place to get their revenge. Luther woke up dazed. Luther was in a dark room, and in front of him was the librarian. He asked the librarian where he was, so the librarian turned on the lights. Luther immediately recognized the place. It was his old house, and his father was sitting on the sofa, semi-conscious. "Why did you bring me here?" asked Luther angrily. The librarian just smirked and instead told Luther he sent the book to him. The librarian explained that killing is a human instinct. It has been there since time immemorial. He explained that killing makes a man strong, wise, and powerful. The librarian told Luther that the Hercules method was perfected instructions on how to kill, passed from generation to generation. A few people with particular talents could only harness the book's knowledge. The librarian told Luther that his father had those talents, but he wasted them. He told Luther that he wanted him to join them and become what he should be. Luther paused, still absorbing the information he had just learned. The librarian told Luther that before he could join them, he must kill his father first. Luther stood up and told the librarian, "No." Luther said he did not need to kill his father because he was not after revenge, and he would not listen to whatever the librarian told him. Disappointed, the librarian told Luther he had tried to do things the easy way and simultaneously kicked his father's head, shattering it into pieces. Luther was shocked. The librarian then told Luther he had called the boss of Vin, the man Luther beat up, and told him the location of Luther's loved one. Luther was enraged. He immediately ran out of the building and headed to his house. Luther arrived at his house and immediately busted through the door. Luther saw his mom and Pete sitting in the living room. They were all right. Luther then realized that he had made the wrong decision. It was not his mom's location that the librarian gave. It was Petra's. Luther told Pete to lock the door and not let anybody inside. Luther told his mom he would explain everything later. He then rushed outside and headed for Petra's house. Meanwhile, the group had reached Petra's house. They barged in and clubbed Petra in the head, rendering her unconscious. They then took her and brought her to their hideout, where they tied her up to a chair. When Petra woke up, the group's leader slapped her across the face. Surprisingly, Petra just laughed at it, saying her father hits harder. Petra then lunged her leg upward, hitting the group leader on his sweat spot. Luther arrived at Petra's house but was too late. The group had already taken Petra. Luther saw Petra's father. Enraged, Luther pinned Petra's father to the wall for doing nothing while Petra was being taken. Petra's father was terrified. Luther raised his fist and hit Petra's father on the chest, causing him to pass out. Petra kept insulting the group leader and spat on his face. Enraged, the group leader punched Petra in the face, causing her to fall down. Unknowingly, Petra was only buying time for Luther to arrive, and he did. Luther busted through the door and went on a rampage. Luther took on 6 men by himself. Some men tried shooting Luther, but it was no use. Bullets could not hurt him. Petra ran out of the room while Luther killed the man brutally. Luther filled the room with blood and the decapitated body parts of his opponents. When Luther left, his mom turned to Pete and told him to explain everything. While Pete was explaining the situation, the librarian suddenly appeared. Shocked, Luther's mom asked him who he was, while Pete blindsided him and hit him with a lamp. Pete's attack had no effect. Instead, the librarian took Pete and threw him across the room. Luther's mom took out her gun and fired at the librarian but missed. The librarian hit Luther's mom, which made her unconscious. Pete kept fighting and threw a knife at him, but the librarian caught it and threw it back at Pete. The knife hit Pete's fingers, which sliced them. The librarian told Pete he would take Luther's mom to the docks and tell Luther to meet them there. With one final attempt, Pete put a knife on the librarian's neck. Annoyed, the librarian took the knife out and pinned Pete on the wall using knives. When Luther reached his house with Petra, he saw the carnage and Pete hanging on the wall. He told Pete he was sorry for dragging him into this mess. Pete apologized to Luther for failing to protect his mom. In his final words, Pete told Luther his mom was taken to the docks. Pete took his last breath and died. Luther was gut-wrenched. Luther told Petra he was the only one who could stop the man responsible for this. Petra was confused, telling Luther they should call the police. But Luther left and went to the docks to face the librarian. At the docks, Luther's mom was tied using a chain wrapped around her hands. The librarian told Luther's mom that anybody could do what he and Luther could if they just harnessed their potential. He told her that he sends copies of the book to thousands of people every year to spread the knowledge. But only Luther was the one who read it and applied the book's teachings. The librarian suddenly said, "We have a guest." The librarian punched his arm on the ground and pulled Luther up from beneath them. He slammed Luther back to the ground, but Luther sprung back up and headed toward his mom, removing her chain. Luther then lunged towards the librarian and punched him on the chin, but the librarian was strong. He took Luther's arms and dislocated them both. Luther was in pain, but he got up and popped his arms back into their joints. Luther rushed towards the librarian, swinging wildly. The librarian dodged every attack. Unfortunately for Luther, one of the strikes aimed at the librarian hit his mom right on her neck, killing her instantly. Luther wept and took his mom's body in his arms. The librarian told Luther he needed to learn precision to bring his talent to the next level. Luther was fuming, and he could now see the future moves of the librarian. Luther attacked and hit the librarian in the eye, but the librarian countered and pierced Luther's stomach, taking out his intestines. The battle was gruesome. Luther got up from behind the librarian and wrapped his intestines around the librarian's neck and twisted it. It snapped the librarian's neck. Luther thought he had won, but the librarian got back up and rearranged his neck. Both men now went on a rampage. The librarian hit Luther multiple times, but Luther grabbed the librarian's arms and ripped it out of his body. A large number of police officers were already outside witnessing the whole thing. The battle caused the dock to explode. When the dust settled, the librarian stood amongst the rubble, but Luther crept behind him and pulled his entire spine out of his body, finally killing him. Luther saw Petra amongst the police officers crying. As he tried to approach her, the police opened fire, killing Luther on the spot.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.